Hello students, this is week 3 of language learning through leadership and service. This week we're going to talk about leadership strengths, and before we get started I wanted to introduce you to another leader. It's a little hard to see, but can you see this little guy? This is Neville Longbottom from the series Harry Potter, and he's an unlikely leader. He is often portrayed as weak and kind of silly, or he makes a lot of mistakes, and yet he is a leader, and he has a strong moral character, and a couple of scenes in the book or in the movie where you can really see his strength. First of all, he stands up to his friends when he thinks his friends are doing something wrong, and then towards the end of the series, he stands up against Voldemort, who is the enemy in the story. So you can see that Neville is a leader, and when he stands up against Voldemort, he leads the rest of his classmates to stand up against Voldemort as well. So we can see leadership strengths in even unlikely places. But let's get started. Let's start talking about different leadership strengths. So as I said, this week we are talking about engaging our strengths, and this comes from chapter 3 of our book, Introduction to Leadership. Let's start with some definitions. So a strength is an attribute or quality of an individual that accounts for successful performance. When we think about strengths, we usually think about physical strengths. So here's a picture of a man lifting a heavy weight. If he can lift it, he's strong. That's a strength, physical strength. But when we're talking about strengths this week, we don't just mean physical strengths. We mean any attribute or quality that can help us to be successful. And those could be strengths that help us to be successful in business or in education or in family life or in social life. So we have many different types of strengths. Realized strengths are personal attributes that represent our strongest assets. They're things that we have practiced. Not only do we have maybe natural talent that we're strong in, but they're things that we have practiced and that we use every day and that we're really strong at. We are energized when we use these attributes, and they help us to perform well. They're things that make us excited. They're things that maybe come easy to us, or over time, after we've worked and developed this strength, now they come more and more easily to us, and they give us that excitement or energy. Unrealized strengths are things that contribute to our successful performance, things that we may become naturally good at, but they're personal attributes that are less visible. They still help us achieve our goals, but they're not realized strengths because there may be things that we haven't exercised that often, or they might be things that are less visible, harder to see. Weaknesses. Weaknesses are limiting attributes which drain our energy and result in poor performance. A lot of times we focus on trying to improve our weaknesses and kind of build up where we are weak. This week in class, we're going to talk about kind of flipping that idea. Instead of focusing on our weaknesses, we're going to focus on our strengths and how to utilize those strengths more often and more effectively. And just like when we think about strengths, we think about physical strengths. When we think about weakness, we probably first think of physical weakness. So here's a picture of a man who's maybe envisioning wanting to be physically strong, and yet he's not physically strong. But weaknesses can be physical, but they can also be other weaknesses as well that can hinder us from being successful in different ways. The strengths equation is talent times investment equals strength. So talent is a natural way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. We might think of the traits that we learned a couple weeks ago. Those are very similar to talents. They're things that we're naturally good at. Talent times investment. Investment is time spent practicing. developing the skills, building the knowledge. Talent times investment equals strength. So when you think about, I like the example of performing on an instrument, or learning to use a musical instrument, and that might come naturally to you. You might naturally be good at music. That kind of comes easy for you, but you have to spend time to practice. Whether it came natural to you or not, you have to put in the time and effort to practice for it to really become a strength. And sports are another good example. You might naturally have some good hand-eye coordination and be good at basketball or good at soccer. But you have to put in the hours to practice and practice and practice to really develop that into a strength. And if you want to be successful as a musician or as a soccer player or a basketball player, you have to put in the hours of practice. And you see that when you think about famous musicians, or you think about famous athletes. They probably had talent. They had some natural way of thinking or feeling or behaving or doing. They might have natural height that will help them to be good basketball players. But they had to put in the hours for it to really become a strength. They had to put in the practice. Here are some other things to consider. Every one of us has identifiable leadership strengths, areas in which we excel or thrive. That comes from your book, but I would echo the same thing. I agree with what your author is saying in the text. We all have strengths that can help us to be good leaders. Focusing on our strengths is linked to positive psychology. This is an idea that we should focus on the good things in people or the good things in our lives. We should focus on what is right in the world rather than focus on weaknesses or focus on fixing what is wrong. There are many different lists of strengths, and some overlap with talents, and sometimes they overlap with traits as well. But here's one of the lists that your book mentions, and then when we take our survey, you'll see some other strengths as well. The Values in Action Institute lists 6 universal virtues, and these are a little bit different, I think, than strengths. But I'll mention these because I like them. They have to do with moral strengths. So courage, justice, humanity, temperance, transcendence, and wisdom. These are all good things. These are probably things that all of us should strive for, but they don't really include all of the strengths. So we're going to use a different list when we take our survey and try to figure out what strengths that we have. This model is really helpful. It comes from your textbook on page 56. And let's start at the top left where it says unrealized strengths. These are things in which we perform well and they give us energy when we do them. So we're pretty good at them, but we don't use them very often. Okay, so those are unrealized strengths. Realized strengths are actions in which we perform well, behaviors which we're good at, or things that we're good at. They give us energy, we're excited to do these actions, and these are the things that we use often, again and again and again. Hopefully, whatever job or industry that you end up in, whatever career you have, hopefully you can use many of your realized strengths. With your unrealized strengths, these are kind of your backup strengths or things that you use less often. And sometimes in life, those can shift. For example, in my home life, I use some strengths that are different than in my work life. But thankfully, I'm able to use strengths in both situations. Then go to the bottom right where it says learned behaviors. These are things in which we can do well. These are kind of like skills or abilities, things that we've learned how to do and do them well. But they're not things that excite us or energize us. So for a lot of students, homework would fall under this category. Thankfully, you've learned how to do it well, but it might not be exciting or energizing for you. And these are things that you might use often or maybe not often. Now, if you're in a job where you're only using learned behaviors, it's probably exhausting, it's tiring. So hopefully, you'll be in a job or career or industry where you're able to utilize your strengths and be excited about what you're doing. But all of us, during certain times, we have to develop these learned behaviors. These are things that we've learned how to do well, but we're not excited about. Whereas strengths are things that we know how to do well and they excite us. They're things that we're passionate about, that we like doing. Then go to the bottom left and you see weaknesses. Weaknesses are areas in which we perform poorly, we're not very good at. And of course, they don't give us energy. We're tired when we try to do these things, often because we fail or we expect to fail because we're not good at these areas. We have variable use. That means sometimes we have to do these things, but hopefully in many cases we can avoid them. But in leadership in the past, a lot of times we focus on those weaknesses and trying to get better and better at. But that saps our energy. It takes away our energy and it takes away our time. We're not able to use that time to focus on areas in which we're good at. So this week, this chapter focuses on how to use our energy and time for realized strengths and maybe for unrealized strengths. So in other words, how can you go about your day by using your strengths rather than focusing on your weaknesses? How do we use our strengths in leadership? First of all, find out what your strengths are. In a moment, I'm going to talk about the survey that we'll take in class this week, and that will help us to find out what our strengths are. And just some personal reflection might also help you to figure out what your strengths are. Number 2, develop our strengths. Remember, practice and investment are necessary to really develop a strength. We talked about how talent plus investment in time and practice equals strength. So you need to develop your strengths. Number 3, recognize and engage the strengths of others, especially where we are weak. In other words, find someone who is strong in an area where you are weak. That is why group work can be so helpful in class, but also in life, because I might be strong in my listening skills when we're talking about English, but I might have another student, a classmate, who is strong in their reading skills. And if we work together, then we have strengths in both. So engage the strengths of others, especially where you're weak. Number 4, foster a positive, strengths-based environment around you, rather than focusing on weaknesses. A lot of times when we focus on our weaknesses, it drains our energy. It makes us exhausted or makes us not motivated because we're like, this is hard, I don't like this, I'm not good at this. Instead, let's focus on what we are good at and try to do those as much as possible. So in this class, I'm going to give you some options and try to use the options where you're good at, where you have strengths. So if I ask you to make a video or to write a paper, think about what you're strong in. Are your speaking skills better? Are your technology skills better? Then make a video. Or are your writing skills better? Is your grammar better? Then write a paper. So focus on the areas where you are strong and foster that strengths-based environment. In other words, try to point out the strengths of others and utilize the strengths of yourself and others. And this is similar to the growth mindset that some of your other teachers might have taught you about. Have that growth mindset. In other words, be positive about where you're strong in and then continue to grow in that. And then when you see a weakness, instead of just being like frustrated or sad by it, see how you can engage others to overcome that weakness or to kind of bypass that weakness. Like I said, we're going to take a strengths questionnaire this week. It's a survey that will help you to identify your strengths. The goal is to help you find out what your strengths are. Try to answer the questions as honestly as you can. Remember, we all have strengths and talents which will help us in life and leadership. And here's an example of the final product. After you take the questionnaire, we will create this chart that shows your strengths. And the different strengths are implementer, innovator, encourager, analytic, and mediator. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what each of those mean. Thanks for watching.